Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I would like to welcome you to today's program, Dispelling Myths Around Demand-Driven Acquisition, which is sponsored by ProQuest. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I would like to point out a few of the features in the webinar software. In the main area of this screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. Along the left-hand side, you will see a chat panel that you can use to submit questions or comments. We will spend some time responding to your questions during the program, so please feel free to submit them throughout. You will also see a separate box for technical questions. Please feel free to use this feature for any technical difficulties you may be experiencing, so our production team can troubleshoot them privately. And finally, please note that today's program will be recorded and all registrants will receive follow-up instructions on how to access the archived version. Our speaker today is Carrie Paulson, Vice President and General Manager of eBooks at ProQuest. At this point, we're ready to get started, so I will hand the presentation over to you, Carrie.
Wonderful, thank you. And thank you, everyone. I appreciate you taking the time to join us today. I've been watching the comments coming in the chat box and seeing lots of people from lots of different places, as far away as we've got a couple attendees here from Greece, Mexico City. I saw Athens, Ohio, you know, a little bit of a segue there from Greece. So we have an hour and a lot to talk about, but I do welcome your questions and comments along the way. We'll try to hold the questions to the end, as said, but if possible, as they're coming through, you know, I'll try to address things as appropriately as I can along the way, but then we'll try to save a little bit of time at the end for discussion. So my name, as Adam said, I'm Carrie Paulson. I am based here in our Mountain View office. So I'm in sunny California today. And when I say sunny, it really is very sunny. It's about 80 degrees. And for those of you in Europe, that's about 30 degrees. So in a pretty good mood, I have to say. So let's get started. So our discussion today is around demand-driven acquisition. And what we would like to do is look at some of the we'll call them myths. It may be debatable whether they're myths or not. We'll try to uncover whether they are. And we'll try to dispel some of the myths that have been talked about in circles in the industry over the past sort of year or two surrounding DDA and its implications to the market. And we'll also then sort of look at some data around library acquisition and some of the drivers and trends behind library acquisitions for books and libraries. And then we'll switch to looking at some best practices around demand-driven acquisition in particular, but also around book acquisition in general. So what are some of these so-called myths that we're talking about? Right, so some of the things we've been hearing, and you may have some to add, feel free to put them into the chat box if you want to add some that we don't bring up here. But one is that DDA is, and when I say DDA, I'm talking about demand-driven acquisition. You could alternate PDA or patron-driven acquisition here, but we'll stick to DDA for the sake of the discussion. So one myth is that DDA is causing libraries to spend less and is disrupting the market. Another is that approval plans, for those of you who understand what approval plans are declining because of DDA. Another is that DDA is hard to manage and unpredictable. Another is that DDA results in budget reductions. And another thing we hear is that if we could go back to a world without DDA, and some publishers have been trying to do so, the world, you know, if we could go back to that world, it would fix the problem and things would go back to the way they were. So in this session, as I said, we'll talk about some budget trends, acquisition overview, and then turn to some best practices. So let's talk about myths and let's talk about data. So data can tell many stories, as we know. What we're looking at here is a chart that has was presented by YBP. I believe it was Michael Violi who presented this at a NISO virtual online conference last year. And this is data looking at expenditure trends and by sale type. So we've got the green line at the top are print records. The blue line are print approval records or print approval sales. And then down at the bottom we see DDA is red line, e-approvals, short-term loans, and e-orders. So one thing we can see quite clearly is that print line and print approvals is coming down. And then at the bottom, those electronic lines are kind of coming up ever so slightly. And across this, we have a line diagonally indicating the number of demand-driven acquisition records that have been delivered to libraries. So by saying records, these are titles, MARC records, for titles that have been selected and switched on for demand-driven acquisition. So we can look at these lines and we can try to draw correlations. And one, I think, that's been put out there is that the increase in demand-driven acquisition records has resulted or caused a decline in the print approvals and print sales. So I think the question here, or the debatable question is there a causal effect? Is that the reason that these numbers are going down? And when we look at data, these lines, we could look at these lines and say, well, yes, that's what's happening. This is going up and that's going down, and the cause of this going down is because this is going up. However, it's a little more complicated than that. And so we've been talking with publishers, we've been talking with libraries over a number of years, but increasingly having these conversations with publishers to help them make sense of what are these lines and what does this data mean. And one of the things we began to feel in these discussions was that the numbers were numbers, but they weren't necessarily representative of the story we were hearing from libraries and the background environment in which were driving these numbers. So we were hearing from libraries, for example, some of the goals they were trying to achieve. They're really trying to provide a wider breadth and depth of content to serve their students and researchers. They're increasingly working within budget limitation. Their goal was to work to deliver and demonstrate better return on investment. So there was an increasing demand to be more outcome focused and to be able to demonstrate outcome for expenditure. And then to better meet expanding and changing user expectations. So with the explosion of content on the internet and everything being immediately available, user expectations were beginning to change, and libraries had a goal to try to better meet the user where they were. We were also hearing about challenges around flat or shrinking budget resources, especially around the economic crisis that we recently went through. There was a flow-on impact to budgets. Increasing competition for funds from other resources, and most often from serials. And that libraries were finding it challenging to manage the transition from print to e. There's a changing landscape with various ebook access models. Ebook workflow support is far from perfect and still leaves a lot to be desired. And that challenge then again of meeting those user expectations. So there was this underlying, all of these variable things in the environment that were impacting the numbers. And we felt we needed to, so we had all this quantitative data that we were sharing with publishers, and others were sharing with publishers, and we're looking at numbers and trying to figure out, well, what's really going on here? But we weren't accurately capturing the qualitative data. So we felt it would be a good idea to conduct a survey and to gather more information from libraries about what's really happening in the library, what challenges they're facing, and what are some of the primary drivers for the choices they're making around book acquisition. So we worked with a third-party independent consultant because we wanted this survey to be agnostic and not, we didn't want our respondents to know they were responding to ProQuest. We didn't want that to potentially affect the way they responded. So we put out a survey around book purchasing trends in academic libraries with special emphasis on ebooks to find out how libraries are coping with the budget changes and in the changes that are happening, and to identify some of the emerging trends, if we could, in collection development and monographs. So this survey we conducted went out to maybe 1,100 people, or somewhere around 1,000 people, and we got about 460 responses. The responses we got were heavily weighted from North America, but we did have some good representation from Europe and other regions, Australasia as well. And it represented a pretty wide spectrum of different job functions within the library, just like we were seeing some of your job functions in the poll at the outset, but a lot of head librarians, acquisition librarians, electronic and digital resource librarians, librarians who are really focused on collection development and resources within the library. And I do, if you'll see, at the bottom of the page, we do have a white paper that is available to you. It's publicly available, and we will make sure to share this information, that link with you, so that you can go and download a copy for yourself. So what did we find? So there were two very strong emerging trends from the data, reflecting a shift in the overall collections budget. So monograph budgets, so what we saw, overall library resource budgets were on the whole either flat or decreasing. So only 25% of respondents reported an increase in their overall library's budget. Within that shrinking overall library resource budget, monographs, the overall monograph budget was even more on the side of flat or decreasing. So only 17% of respondents showed an increase in their overall monograph budget. On the other hand, the journal's budget had a stronger result in terms of increase versus flat or decreasing. So what that tells us is that within the overall library budget, between monographs and journals were getting a bigger share at the expense of the monograph budget. Then within that monograph budget, libraries were reporting for print titles an even increasingly dwindling piece of the pie. So only 14% of respondents reported an increase, meaning that 86% of the libraries were reporting either a flat or decreasing budget. And then ebooks, as you can see, were taking a much bigger portion of the overall monograph budget, with 34% reporting an increase in their budget. So monograph budgets are eroding as funds shift to finance electronic journals due to price increases in serials. And ebooks account for a growing proportion of the book budget as libraries move from print to electronic. So none of this, I think, is surprising or all that controversial, but it does capture the dynamics behind where dollars are going. In response to the question, has your ebook budget changed this year? As we saw, 34% reported that it had increased, but by and large, even ebook budgets were still more on the side of flat or declining. And as we can see, this chart it really just kind of gives a visual of that shrinking print budget versus that increasing ebook budget. So there really is a shift still going on between print and Again, no surprise. And the top reasons for the changes, for the ebook budget changes, the top reasons for increase were top reasons for increase in monograph, the ebook budget increase. So top reasons for increase in ebook budgets were the shift from P to E, budget increase, DDA programs growth. So libraries did report that in some cases, demand-driven acquisition programs actually caused their budgets to increase, demand, and then supporting distance learning. The top reasons for the decrease reported were budget cuts. So funding cut, less money to spend. Lower enrollment, more budget cuts, and economy and inflation. So the largest reasons for that book budget decreasing was around budget cuts. And that was a theme we saw just really predominantly throughout the responses we saw. Another interesting thing that was reported is that libraries are increasingly using more than one acquisition model to purchase ebooks for their library. So the question was, how many ebook models do you use today? And the response is 70% of the libraries who responded are relying on multiple acquisition models for ebooks. So they're not just buying, sort of saying, well, this is the right model for us and buying everything. They're using different models to buy different content. With 15% reported using 4 or more access models to acquire their ebooks. So what does this tell us? With acquisition models, one size doesn't fit all. Different libraries are using, have different collection needs, and that can be in regard to frontlist versus backlist, what challenges they're trying to overcome, what budget challenges they have, user expectations, and a myriad of all kinds of other reasons why a library may choose one acquisition model over another. And different acquisition models, of course, fit different collection needs. So, it's not a one-size-fits-all. And I think it's important to look at this then and remember, we hear, I think we've heard in presentations and different discussions in the industry over the last couple of years, labeling sometimes access models as being good or bad, where somebody thinks demand-driven acquisition or short-term loans or another acquisition model is just great and they really love it and it's good, it's just a good model. Or others saying, well, demand-driven acquisition is a bad model and it's something, so labeling things good or bad is a mistake because really it's not about one versus the other, but really is about how these acquisition models fit in harmony with each other, and how libraries are using them to serve different needs within the library. So we like to look at or think about acquisition models in terms of where they sit in the spectrum in terms of what the library is trying to achieve. So we hear from libraries, in some cases they're looking to build a collection that they own in perpetuity. And then in other cases, they're really looking to fund access to a broad base of content. Neither one of these is good or bad, but it is important for libraries to understand what they are trying to achieve in terms of these different sort of, on the spectrum of ownership versus access as they're choosing the ways in which they're buying. Similarly with frontlist and backlist, different acquisition models tend to serve frontlist versus backlist in different ways, and publishers tend to make content available sometimes in different access models depending on it if it's frontlist or backlist. So on one end of the spectrum we have title by title purchasing, where you pick and choose your titles and you own them outright. That's heavily weighted toward frontlist content as it becomes available, and heavily weighted toward, fully ownership-based and fully, collection building. On the other end of that spectrum, you have the subscription model, which is fully pay for access with no ownership, and usually is geared toward backlist content with the frontlist embargoed. And the other access from DDA, short-term loans, sort of fall somewhere along that spectrum. With access to own, we see falling squarely in the middle. And we'll talk a little bit about access to own at the end. But it is really important for a library as they're thinking about how they're buying content and why, not just about the price or not just about the access model, but really in terms of, well, what am I trying to achieve with this content? What are my needs for this content to help really make the best decision about how to buy it or how to make it available. Similarly, and this looks a little bit like a paint chart, but the idea here is really about, that it is a continuum. Access models do sit on a continuum, and they are there. There are choices to be made, and it's good to have many choices in terms of how you're making content available to your end users. Again, aligned with what you're trying to achieve, and ensuring that those precious dollars are really going toward achieving the right outcome for you and your users and your budget. And so what we would say along that is that really it's about building the right strategy for your particular library, your particular budget needs, your particular acquisition goals, and what may look, what may be appropriate for one library might not necessarily be appropriate for your library. So back to those myths. When we go back to that chart and we think back to that chart and we look at what do those lines mean. So the numbers show that the approval plan, approval and print sales are down. It also shows that demand-driven acquisition sales are up, and that demand-driven acquisition sales are not replacing a one-to-one the approval sales. And this is alarming for, can cause alarm bells in terms of, the question, are we cannibalizing, the sales or the volume of sales that we had in the past? And this is an important question for publishers, of course. The lines and the data, however, do not show causation. They do not show that the reason that the print sales are going down is because the demand-driven acquisition sales are going up. And if we think about the data coming from the survey and what libraries are reporting in terms of budgets and other external things impacting the way they're spending their dollars and the dollars they have to spend, we can see that there is an environment with lots of different factors acting as drivers for some of these changes. So these numbers could show some correlations, incorporating those broader trends between demand-driven acquisition sales going up and print and approval sales going down. But again, it's not necessarily because libraries aren't necessarily choosing demand-driven acquisition. The reasons that they're choosing it are there and are not going away. And so they're making choices, sometimes with fewer dollars to spend, and that's the actual outcome, the reason for the outcome of the lower expenditure. If libraries have fewer dollars to spend, they're going to spend fewer dollars, regardless of which access model they're spending them through. The data could also show that libraries don't necessarily always have the right framework or information to build a DDA program that properly supports their goals. And we have, we've seen cases, and we hear cases sometimes, case studies presented at conferences where libraries report, well, and the outcome was we saved all this money. And saving money is good if your goal is to save money. But if your goal is to provide greater access to your students or build a collection of owned books or some other thing, saving money isn't necessarily equaling success. So again, it's very important that as you're building a program for acquisition with whichever access models you're using, you're understanding what success looks like. So what is really going on, I think the question still remains, is correlation with the decline in print and the increase in DDA real. In some cases, yes, we are seeing this shift between the two models. How and why are libraries using DDA programs? And how did implementation or pricing on vendor and publishers affect the situation? So there's a number of factors contributing to the trends we're seeing, and will continue to do so. And I have to stop here and pause and just, we talked about having some data here from the publishers to just highlight the issue, but the number of publishers have put data into the marketplace. I know we've seen some great presentations from the likes of Lisa Noctegal at Wiley and Rebecca Seeger at OUP, kind of explaining the challenges of the finances of publishing. So the pain that scholarly publishers are feeling with the shift from print to electronic is real. In some cases, they're seeing a decline in their overall revenue, which is problematic to their publishing program. But in other cases, they are struggling, just like libraries are struggling with the changing demands and changing expectations. They're struggling with the changing models in how the revenue fits the world in which they're used to looking at. So they're used to having a P&L for a book, and that P&L was usually very much front-loaded as content was bought at the outset through approval or bought at the outset through firm orders, and that's shifting to become a longer cycle for sales. And so it is a challenge for libraries for publishers to figure out, well, how do I know if this is sustainable or not? There's a question, not just is it sustainable, but how do I even know? How do I build the right model to understand how to recognize revenue and be confident that I'm going to remain whole with the shifting way in which I'm being paid for my content? So we all have challenges. We're going to continue to have challenges for the foreseeable future. The question is, what do we do? Can we go back? Can we just shut things down, and would things go back to normal? Well, I think when we think about the survey responses, the answer is no, because the way the world looked before is not the way it looks today. We have these real challenges around budgets. Every dollar is more rare, as we have fewer dollars to spend, it means every dollar becomes more precious. And it requires that we are increasingly diligent and increasingly data-driven around the decisions we're making and why we're making them. And that requires delivering stronger outcomes. And books are not immune to that. Journals have had the benefit of being digital and having data around demand that has really helped libraries continue to justify increasing expenditure on journals, and books have lagged behind. And if we are to continue to have robust book budgets and be able to provide a robust program of books for our users, we need to be able to better connect the expenditure with the outcome. And outcome is not always just usage, but that is one factor that helps determine outcome. So the future of our success depends on driving demand and depends on being able to better capture that usage and bring it back into that feedback loop around expenditure and outcome. So vendors have a responsibility here, and that is, as you have a wide range of choices, as your dollars are very precious, as you need to deliver outcomes, it is our responsibility to help guide and help deliver the best value for those dollars, to bring to the table the data we have and the experience we have with the various ways of purchasing, to take the time to really understand your goals, what you need to achieve and why, and then to consult on how best to manage the purchasing programs, especially those that are evidence-based. It's also our responsibility to continue to innovate solutions that address the needs and challenges. So continue to bring forward and work toward solutions that bring the best value and support the community, both from the publishers and the researchers, in terms of a sustainable ecosystem. It's very important as well that we continue to really understand the environment that we're working in, and understand the drivers and the trends so that we can incorporate that into our thinking and our innovation. So I'm going to turn attention now on, we talked about the framework for building the best and kind of most responsible demand-driven acquisition programs, the framework for really achieving success. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what are some of the best practices around demand-driven acquisition. So I don't want to be prescriptive here, and when you put things down with step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it does look prescriptive, but this is really meant to be just a sort of a discussion around what are some of the ways in which you can really ensure you're achieving success with your dollars and your book expenditure. So first of all, it's very important that you create a consultative relationship with your vendor or your vendors. In almost all cases, you're working with multiple vendors, whether it's publisher direct, whether it's an aggregator, whether it's an aggregator in combination with a bookseller. So it's very important that you do really cultivate those consultative relationships and ask your vendor questions, but also that you share information about what you're trying to achieve and what your challenges are. Utilize a setup checklist. So there's a lot of different factors that go into building a good outcome. So it's important you kind of have, what are the things I need to make sure I'm getting to and looking at as a part of my setup. Craft your profile to fit your budget or collection strategy. So if you are trying to achieve ownership of a lot of titles, it's important that you factor that into how you profile your content. It's also important to work within your budget limitations. Understand the system controls, and then we'll talk a little bit about that. The mechanisms you can use and the levers to manage expenditure, to make it manageable, to make it containable, and to help really make sure that you're working within your budgets. And then review your programs regularly. And this is something we find, and it came up in the survey actually, we asked how often do you review your profiles or review your program? And really we heard kind of ad hoc or not really very much. So it's that sometimes the devil's in the detail, and getting the detail of the usage and the expenditure and the driving trends. It's really important that you review that regularly, and then you continue to kind of tweak your program based on that information. So running through the checklist, contact your vendor, discuss your needs, and determine your goals. So it's very important here, as you're consulting with your vendor or looking at your expenditure or looking at maybe the year before and what you want to do for the coming year, that you understand what your goals are and you share those with your vendor. That at the end of this, I want to own a lot of content, or I really want to use this to supplement my core purchasing and provide a wider range of access to non-core titles, or whatever it is. But it's important that you share that information. It's also important that you share information about your budget. And quite often, you may be shy to do that because you don't want the vendor to spend it all for you if they don't have to. But on the other side, if it's not understood really what your budget limitations are, you can really make missteps in terms of how you build a program, and you can either spend way too quickly and run out of money, or you can, on the flip side, just really not scratch the surface on what the goal was for expenditure. So 10 questions, and these are just some sample questions. It's like going to your, your GP. You show up, be prepared, come with a number of questions that you can ask and really get the most information and get the best use of your data, your vendor's experience. So things like what percentage of titles can I expect to be purchased in my program? Or can you provide some data for libraries that are similar to mine that I can use as a benchmark in terms of expectations with expenditure or access? Or what tools are available for tracking expenditure? How do I set that up? How can I keep track of where I am with my budget? And what are the options for short-term loans, for example? How should I or how might I incorporate short-term loans into my program, if at all? So number of questions, you make up your own, but these are a few we thought were quite important to cover with your vendor. Understand levers. So the other really important thing is there are a number of different drivers and factors that will influence expenditure in a program, evidence-based or demand-driven acquisition program. So, for example, the number of titles, some obvious ones like how many titles you make available to your users will influence how much you spend. The more titles you make available, the more you'll spend. The number of patrons you have, the number of remote and off-campus users. Those tend to be higher users of electronic resources. How you're making the content discoverable and how discoverable you're making it. We hear often a library will load all the MARC records and that they see one level of expenditure and then they make a change and they switch everything on in their discovery layer and suddenly their usage goes up by 30% and their expenditure goes up by 30%. So it's important to understand how discovery impacts usage and expenditure. The amount of typical usage of electronic resources at your library. Different libraries have different footprints in terms of electronic use. The time of year you launch your service. If you launch it over the summer, you might get a false sense of security in terms of usage and expenditure. So it's important to pay attention to those peaks and troughs and where you are in that cycle. Which publishers you're including. Different publishers, again, have different usage, different demand and different usage, and whether or not you're exposing core or peripheral titles or front list or backlist. And these are all obvious things, but a lot of libraries misstep in terms of thinking about how these different levers are going to impact their program and impact their expenditure. So set up a program structure and create content profile. It's important when you set up a profile, you're thinking both about the content and what to include from a content perspective, whether it's front list or backlist, what language, all those sort of factors. But on the other side of this, there are functionality factors to incorporate in terms of maybe a maximum cost of book or limitations on pricing, or how many simultaneous users you want to use, or what licenses you want to purchase under, how much you're willing to allow for each user. So there's a lot of various functionality factors that can be built in at the profiling stage. So discoverability and budget. We talked a little bit about how discovery can impact your expenditure and budget, but at the same time, you're really not optimizing your program if users aren't finding this these wealth of resources. Similarly, this can be one of the most time-consuming aspects of a demand-driven acquisition program or an evidence-based program where records are sort of going on and off and being updated on a regular basis and being sent to you, and then they're loaded into your catalog or loaded into your discovery layer. It's important you talk to your vendor about what are the ways you can automate this and take a lot of that manual labor out. So, for example, ProQuest supports automated holdings, and other vendors support automated holdings. In Summon, we support in Summon, OCLC, and ALMA, and this means those records just live there. And rather than sending records back and forth to libraries, say, turn these on, turn these off, and having those MARC records sort of being loaded and unloaded, we just send a file straight to Summon or OCLC or ALMA and say, light these titles up, or turn these titles off. And it takes a great deal of that manual work out of the process, and it also removes that that potential for being out of sync with the catalog versus what's available. So it's important to really look at discovery and catalog records and get this right. Really look for ways to streamline this workflow, because it takes a great deal of that sort of work out of the process. And similarly with invoicing and budget, very important to understand how best to manage to a budget, whether or not you're able to set up budget alerts to notify you as you go where you're at in your spending, and how that equates to your your deposit or the budget you're working to, and really making sure you get those reports to help keep you on track and in line, so you're not running out of money too early or you're not overshooting the mark. And there's a number of different factors you can bring in, and we've seen libraries. We have some very good examples of ways in which libraries have utilized different controls to rein spending in or expand it. So we have cases, for example, where a library used Swinburne University in Australia as an example, had a pretty drastic budget cut for a particular year. So they had a very predictable expenditure year after year over kind of 8 years of using a demand-driven acquisition program, and suddenly they were told, you know, we're cutting your budget by 40% for this particular year because of the Australian dollar exchange rate. So they needed to find a way to kind of take this known program and rein it into that budget constraint. So there's a number of things that they took a pretty scientific approach and kind of, you know, reined it in ways using different levers, different mediation controls, price limits, refactoring the profile, bringing in some limitations at the user level that kind of brought it right into where they needed without the end users feeling this kind of real disruption in the service or program. So make sure you understand what are the controls within the systems that you can bring in. Also to avoid, you know, we've seen over the last couple of years publishers making short-term loan price changes, sometimes embargoing some content, or raising prices. And these things happen, you know, after the profile's already selected these titles. So there are ways in which you can bring in price limitations into the system or into your profile to catch those automatically, so you're not having to keep watching and you know, making changes every time a price changes. So again, you can use mediation so that if a price goes above a certain limit, it's still there, but you have to mediate it, or you can use profiling profiles to actually bring those titles back out and turn them off if they're outside your pricing levels. So, for example, we talked about mediation. This is just an example that we have in our system where you can choose to mediate above a certain price, or choose to mediate if the publication date is outside a particular range. So ways in which you can kind of catch exceptions that sort of come in after the fact. And this is the important now, the review the usage and expenditure. We recommend that you do this quarterly because you know, things do change, and it's important that you know where you're at with your program and how it's tracking along, so that you can keep changing it as you go, as you need to. But at least, you know, a couple times a year, really. So analysis is key. It's very important that you look at your data and you spot the trends and you understand kind of organically how the program works, how it's being accessed, and you know, when your high use periods are, so that you understand how it's impacting your expenditure, and the quality of the program. So make sure you request reports from your vendor. I know we have a number of very detailed reports and ways that we can allow you to see what's happening, but it's very important that you get this data and you understand it, and that you get help from your vendor if you don't. And then know the controls. Be prepared to turn things on or off. Change your permissions. Use a budget tracker. We've heard cases where libraries turn on demand-driven acquisition and they say, oh my God, I just spent all my money in 6 weeks. It was a disaster. Or, we turned it on and we had all this money and we didn't spend anything. So make sure you understand, you set up the right alerts so that doesn't happen. And it should never need to happen. There's ways to control that. So this is just an example of some of the reporting, but some of the things you want to be able to see are what are the triggers, how are people triggering, and how much time are they spending, what value are we getting, how is content used post acquisition, so you can understand how the different access models and post purchase use are tied together. Are titles you purchasing getting use after you purchase them? And what models contribute to the best post-purchase use? Another really great thing, if you can find it, we have a tool called Patron Analytics, which enables libraries to get more specific information about who's using the content or triggering the content and how. We've had a lot of really great stories about how libraries have incorporated this. So it's a way the library can choose to ask what they want to. The questions or the data that they collect is completely customizable. It's optional. And it asks for this from the patron once, and then it links it to their authentication. So every time they come through in the future, they don't have to tell us they're an undergraduate student or which faculty they belong to or any of that. It's stored against their login, and we are able to infuse that data into the usage reports and into the invoice reports. And we have some really great stories around how libraries have been able to use that data to show their different departments or their different selectors how much of the content is being used or triggered by their particular constituents, and help get more support for bringing dollars into the program, or more support from the institution for what outcomes they're having in terms of who's using it and how and what value that's bringing. So based on that data then, adjust your profile. Like, look at what's being used, look at where the demand is. You may want to add more content in an area that's of high use. You may want to scale back an area that's not really interesting. And just make sure that you understand those drivers and adjust that profile regularly. So it's really bringing the best value. So I think whether or not we dispelled any myths here, I don't know. One of the things I hope we come away with is an understanding of the need to continue to meet users where they are and ensure that we are using the right, being able to deploy the right access models for the right, for the goals we're trying to achieve, but also the importance of demand. I think especially as we're increasingly encroached on by serials budgets, as demand has been able to be more justified for those resources, it's important that we continue to, and as budget dollars are precious and we need to make sure we're spending them for the right resources, going back to a world where we purchase on speculation, going back to a world where we buy things and 40% or more of those resources are never used, is not really the way in which we're going to continue to build a strong environment for books. So being able to deliver the things users really need and to be able to spend the money in the places that are bringing the best results continues to be an important way and will continue to be so in the future. So what can we do for the future, or what's in store for the future? One of the things that we are looking at, so we're continuing to push ahead to look for ways that we can bring better sustainability for publishers, and also for libraries. We heard from libraries when those libraries who use short-term loans, for example, when the price changed and went above a certain point, libraries found themselves spending an increasing amount of money toward access and less toward ownership. The price of short-term loans went up, and the dollars they were spending for accessing that way contributed to less ownership. So it kind of threw what was before something that kind of worked for them, it kind of threw it out of balance in terms of what they were trying to achieve. And publishers, as you know, are struggling with that delayed revenue, and so have tried changing their pricing or in some cases embargoing content. And embargoing hasn't had a great impact on their overall sales either. If content's not there and it's not discoverable, it isn't being used, and that's not necessarily a good outcome either. So we are committed to continuing to look for models where we can bring that value, can bring that demand into the equation, whether it is through data that we're bringing to the purchase decisions. So, taking that usage data and making it available to libraries while they're making those purchase decisions, or continuing to drive that demand-driven model. So a new model that we're introducing this year, mid this year and not too long from now, is called Access to Own. And the principle is it uses the same principles of demand-driven acquisition. But instead of paying for uses as short-term loans and then having that not contribute to ownership, in this case, the library can make content available prior to purchase. They can pay for each use. And the payment they make for each use actually goes toward ownership of the book. It goes toward paying off the book over time. So it's a little bit like a rent-to-own model. The trade-off is that the loan price is much higher. So each use is at a higher price point, but what the library gets for that is that money is actually money in the bank toward ownership, and they don't have to buy that book at the end after those uses. For the publisher, this brings forward it's a more, I think, a more fair price for use. That it brings forward that the payment for that use, but it also, in the end, results in more ownership. So the money that's being spent is incrementally going toward ownership. So that's my presentation to you. We still have 7 minutes, and there's been a lot of questions. I realized I wasn't as good as multitasking as I thought I would be. So I apologize that I haven't been bringing these questions and answering them in the discussion. But we have 7 minutes now, so I'm gonna address some of these questions. Feel free to keep posting. So one of the first questions that came up was, how does DDA affect interlibrary loan? It's a good question. It's something that we had as a goal at the outset of when we launched this model way back sort of 10, 12 years ago, that the opportunity really was there to be able to provide an alternative and immediate access to content where an interlibrary loan may have been used in the past. We do have a number of libraries who have used either DDA purchasing or short-term loans in lieu of interlibrary loan request. And we've also had libraries who've been able to sort of quantify how much it saved them in their interlibrary loan budget. So Newcastle University, for example, in the UK, was able to actually quantify about 20% savings in their ILL budget through using these models. And by doing that, they were able to get a shift in dollars from the interlibrary loan budget into their book purchasing budget. So that's not maybe the answer you're looking for, but it is related, and there are ways in which these models have been deployed. I think there are better ways we could better integrate with ILL software to make this a more viable option. But it is a way to kind of pay for that immediate access where a user is looking for something the library doesn't have in their own collection. Another question, what is meant by the phrase stronger outcomes? Is that publisheries for increasing revenue? And no, not at all. What I mean by stronger outcomes is really about stronger outcomes in the library. And we have a number of libraries who've kind of brought this forward. Well, we needed to show I'll use an example just from last week. What a library shared with me, a librarian at Northumbria University in the UK. They have a mandate to increase reading. And reading of books in particular at their university, and so that for the being able to quantify or find stats or bring data forward that shows that they're successful at achieving that goal. That's more what I mean by outcomes, whether it's user engagement, better student success. It could be budgetary in terms of outcomes, that but it's really, what is the library trying to achieve? What is the institution trying to achieve? And how does the programs that they implement or the content they make available help them get to those, help them achieve those goals? So that's what I mean by outcomes. I'm sure publishers also have outcomes in terms of dollars, but really also I think publishers have goals in terms of, are we publishing the right content? Is the content we're publishing the content that is needed in the this area of study or by readers? So I think on both sides it's really about the goals that the library or the publisher is trying to achieve. There's a question here, what is the trend for academic libraries to purchase ebooks for standing orders compared to print? And I'm trying to think, I recommend that you go to white paper and look at the data. I don't know if we had anything that spoke specifically to that trend, but I think it's an area we haven't quite really captured as well as we could, standing orders with ebooks, and I don't have a great answer to that one. So I'm sorry, but we could probably get you some more information and look through the data and see if there was anything that came up. Okay, there's a comment here. This isn't really about driving transparency around individual titles through the creation of real behavior data. And now librarians are finding many of these titles found wanting. This is just like the print advertising market when advertising went digital. Spending becomes more transparent and effective. Isn't it ultimately a good thing to take out inefficiencies in the scholarly publishing and library market? Yes, I think so. I think that's one of the things I am trying to say is that transparency is a good thing. It's sometimes a painful thing, but if we're going to succeed as an industry, if books are going to remain relevant and libraries are going to continue to spend money on books, then we need to make sure that there is that transparency and we're spending money on the right books. I think that's an important point. But those are very apt comments, so thank you, Tommy. So it looks like we are just about at time. I'm going to take maybe 1 or 2 more minutes, and if you want to stay on, you're welcome to. And then we'll have to wrap up. There's more questions than I can answer, unfortunately. But I'm happy to receive questions offline as well, and to take some of the correspondence offline if any of you want to follow up. So here's a question. Could you describe again quickly how records are accessible in the discovery without loading them? So yes, so basically when we're able to do that, what we do is we send the discovery systems a feed in the background. We send them a regular feed, all of the titles we have available, so that they're able to index them and they have them, they're known to the discovery layer. So everything lives then in the knowledge base, all the content that we have. In the case where we do automated holdings or automated for DDA, when we run a profile, what we do is we send a feed, a KBART feed or other type of feed to the knowledge base of the discovery layer to say, for this library, turn these titles on, or for this library, turn these titles off. So it's a really lightweight feed with a book identifier and a status that enables the discovery layer to know to turn it on or turn it off for discovery in your particular library. We can also then supplement that, if the library wants, with telling the library when a book has actually been purchased. So it gives it a slightly different status versus, switched on for DDA, it actually becomes a title that's held as an owned title in the library collection. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts. I hope that explains it. But it is a much more elegant solution than schlepping MARC records back and forth, which can be, painful for all kinds of reasons. So one more question. Could you give us some references to the Wiley and OUP reports on economics of their publishing and the impact of DDA? So, and unfortunately, I don't have the reports handy, but I can try to see if we can find links to those presentations online. There were several presentations given at at ALA, and I know there was one at the last Charleston. I know Rebecca Sager gave a great presentation overview of kind of the economics of publishing there. So they're in both cases, they've been really sort of helpful to understand, what from a operational level, what the challenges publishers are having around these different access models and financial models that come with them. Where they've kind of gone through this long period of consistency and really knowing, how to predict how money's going to come in. These models kind of throw a wrench in that. The way that they kind of talk about their finances kind of helped expose that. So I've gone a few minutes over. Thank you all for your time. Really appreciate your attendance today and your attention. And please do feel free to follow up with me offline. I'm happy to follow up with any questions or any further discussion. But again, thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Kari. I would like to take just a moment to give you a virtual round of applause. Thank you so much for spending time with us and sharing all of this information. It's really been great. I would just like to remind folks that we have recorded today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from ACRL in Choice that will include instructions on how to access the archived version of today's presentation. Thanks again to everyone for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed this session, and have a great day today. Bye-bye.